All right, so for this edition of DevLog, I have a exciting guest here. Go ahead and make yourself known.
Hello, everyone. Hello, wide world audience of Olive Hill Studios. Thank you for joining us.
That's my twin brother Eric, and he's joining us from Bangkok, Thailand. Very generous of you to join us today, Eric. So I thought what might be kind of fun for people is if we talk a little bit about some of the multiplayer implementation that we did because this was our first multiplayer game, and I felt like it was definitely an interesting challenge, and I wanted to kind of get your perspective on it and just kind of talk about it a little bit, maybe to try to help maybe folks who are planning on maybe trying to implement their first multiplayer game, like some things that we learned and some things we would have done differently. So how's that sound?
Yeah, that does sound great. And were we going to kind of approach it from the idea that kind of like for a base, getting kind of a base introduction of the concepts, and then into the specific tweaks, or are we going to focus on kind of the tweaking the more basic scene setup?
Well, I was thinking even more broad based than that. Basically, like, um, for example, I'll start you off with this question. Do you feel like when we implemented the multiplayer, so I guess before this project, I don't want to speak for you, but I feel like tell me if you confirm this or not. But I feel like one of the ways that we thought about multiplayer was like, okay, we'll just get like the single player experience like fully down, and then we'll just add multiplayer on top of it at the end. And I would say that standing where we're standing today, I don't think there's any way we would recommend that approach anymore, right? For somebody doing their first multiplayer game. Do you agree with that?
Definitely. I mean, we kind of heard the things on game dev forums, different YouTube video comments and stuff. And I think you know what we had seen a lot is um, strongly discouraging trying multiplayer for your first couple projects. So for full disclosure, this is our second kind of larger scale project, and by large scale, I mean we're still talking small indie games here, but this is definitely the second project that we've worked on that's outside the scope of kind of like a Pong recreate, right? So there's definitely a reason why that comes up a lot, and I think it has to come down to what Andrew's talking about is when you want to do multiplayer, you want to you need to think about it early. It definitely is going to be very difficult to create your single player experience and add multiplayer on at the end. What you're going to find is, and we'll show you guys some examples of this, but almost every feature that you design, you have to approach it with multiplayer in mind. If you don't, you're going to have a lot of frustration going back and kind of rejiggering and reconnecting the wires of your systems to make it multiplayer adaptable. So I think that's one thing I would say is when you want to do multiplayer, I would say don't be afraid of it. I mean, we're tackling it here just on our second project. I would say, and part of the purpose of this channel, these videos, is to kind of encourage more of you to willing to take on something like adding multiplayer, because I think a lot of people want to do it maybe earlier in their you know game dev careers, I guess, than maybe not to be like scared of it. But that being said, in order for it not to be a frustrating experience, you want to kind of approach all your design choices and all your systems with it in mind.
Yeah. Like I would say that at the point that we implemented multiplayer, what were some of the things that we had in the game? We had the basic first person controller system. We had, we knew we wanted to add a jump to the game, a crouch, walk, run. That's it as far as kind of the basic person controller. And I think we had maybe one item in the game, like the flashlight, and then we had like the basic of the first level laid out as far as the uh, not even really so much the visuals, but at least the first level designed as far as like the colliders and stuff. Am I missing anything, or that I feel like that's an accurate statement of where the game was at when we attempted to implement multiplayer. Did I miss anything though?
Yeah, and that seems about right. And we were tempted to kind of continue and create more items because it's fun. It's like, oh, cool, and more items in the game, right? But the thing is, we kind of pulled ourselves back and be like, okay, let's let's make sure that we implement an item pickup inventory management system that's going to be coherent with multiplayer. And it's a good thing we did because we went through a complete rewrite of the way the item system worked because of multiplayer.
Yeah, so I think that's one thing I will say is like if it's your first multiplayer game, then I would definitely really heed our advice about addressing multiplayer as early as you possibly can because for example, the way we had set up the item system was just basically not going to work for multiplayer. It basically was just essentially dead in the water. And we didn't know that until we started implementing multiplayer. And then it made us kind of understand, oh, we have to, any mechanic that we're implementing in this game, we have to think about, well, how does multiplayer affect this, right? And really kind of um, approach it from that perspective. Now, my guess is that more seasoned game developers might be able to do the other approach where you just like implement a full single player game because in their heads they're kind of almost subconsciously thinking about how to set this up to be extensible to multiplayer. But for us, and I think anyone doing it for the first time, really getting going through that initial multiplayer setup is really helpful in terms of learning like okay well just exactly how does my game implement multiplayer. And I guess to pull back the curtain a little bit on that, maybe we'll just talk kind of high level. um, the way that multiplayer works in our game and in fact many games is that there's a ton of information in your game that actually doesn't need to update. For example, the mansion is going to be in the same physical location throughout the entire lifespan of a round of our game, right? So one of the things that we wouldn't want to use bandwidth for is to have player one's version of the game constantly telling player two's version, hey, the mansion's right here, the mansion's right here, the mansion's right here. And by right here, I mean like the actual, vector 3 position of the mansion. Like, of course the mansion's there. That's not going to change, right? So that's an example of kind of a piece of information that doesn't need to be communicated or synchronized between both players' versions of the game. However, player one's position in the world obviously is dynamic and that could change. And it's really, really important for player two's instance of the game needs to be aware of where player one is. So right now, player one's like about 10 feet ahead of me. If I move up and get in player two's face, it's really important that player two's version of the game reflects that, right? So, just from a simple concept, the different players' positions, well, now that is something that needs to be synchronized between the two versions of the game that are running. So, you almost have to think of everything in those terms. Like what sorts of things need to be synchronized, what sorts of things don't. And that was like a very, very new thing for us. We never had to really consider that before with our other games. So that was kind of like a big game changer for me. I don't know if you want to comment on that at all.
Yeah, and so then I think the next branch from that, as Andrew was saying, uh, what's static and what is changing that needs to be synchronized. Then once you identify what needs to be synchronized, I think you have another branching, which is what needs to be synchronized and needs to constantly be updated versus what needs to be synchronized and is more of a one-off action. So just to give an example of that is like with the player's position, you have to constantly be updating that. And are we going to show how the synchronizer node helps you with that kind of a thing?
I was thinking about doing that, but I was thinking about maybe doing that a little bit later. I think for this, I wanted to keep it a little bit more high level topic, but we definitely will kind of peel back the curtain on that stuff a little bit later.
Okay, so guys, so maybe that's for a later video, so check that out. But yeah, so maybe we can focus then on just what needs to be synchronized, what not. I will say we'll definitely show this in another devlog. Is once you get to the synchronization information, there's sort of two ways you can do that, and there's different tools that that you can use specifically. Like we're showing, how Gato, what tools they provide. but there's tools to help with the constantly synchronized type things, such as the player position, versus the more one-off actions. So, for example, in this case, if maybe Andy player two, if you want to throw the candle down on the ground, perhaps.
Yeah, so here's the perspective of player one, and if I were to be player two, and if I were to drop the candle, you can see on player one's version of the game, we do see that there is now a candle in the world, and so that's an example of something that needs to be synced, but it doesn't need to constantly be synced. It's kind of like, hey, player one's trying to drop a candle right here. Player two, your version of the game needs to reflect that reality, basically. Um,
Yeah, and
Go ahead.
you might think like, okay, well, you know, yeah, it doesn't have to be synchronized, but why don't you just monitor it all anyways? And you have to think about it from a practical standpoint. Like the player's position, it's sort of a property that you can constantly access. Um, Hence, you can constantly monitor it. But like in this case, with the dropping of the candle, that's like a function call, right? So you can't constantly monitor that function call, or at least that I'm aware of using the tools. So that's sort of what calls out for, because I think that's something that we were discovering as we're designing, and this is what you guys can keep in mind as you're designing your systems. It really helps to, because you'll know what tools you're going to use for which path. You're going to use a synchronizer tool to help with things like player position. Let me think what else. What other things do we? What are some other examples of things that kind of get constantly
Constantly updated.
synchronized?
Well, for
Yeah,
example,
player position.
the not only the player position, but kind of where they're pointing, so that you can see the flashlight and where that's pointing. I will say some eagle-eyed observers will have noticed that we actually do have a desync here, because this flashlight on the ground in player one's version is actually in the hand of player two in player two's version. So we're still battling this. Like we're still kind of trying to stamp out these bugs and these kind of instances of desynchronization. So it's something that we're still kind of learning from. Um, so you know, it's just one of those things that you should be aware that you're going to kind of have to constantly be on top of these things as you're developing for multiplayer. And I think to tie it back to kind of my original point, don't you feel like if our code base was even like 10 or 15% bigger when we tried to implement multiplayer, it would have been like very overwhelming as far as getting all that stuff working?
Yeah, I think the approach we've been taking in this, I think it's worked out really well. Is as tempting as it can be to rush it along and put the next system in place. Like our next mechanic is going to be the ghost hunt. As tempting as it's going to be to go ahead and continue that when you have items done, we've kind of made as a best practice is we're going to go system, adapt to multiplayer, system, adapt to multiplayer, system, adapt to multiplayer. So essentially, every system that's introduced and written will be adapted and um, to work with multiplayer first before moving to the next system. That just kind of prevents this giant code base that needs to all be updated and adapted for multiplayer. Which, like Andy was saying, if you're a seasoned programmer, maybe that's a trivial thing. But for us, that have you know roughly 2 years or so of experience working on this, this is the and so this is the system and way of approaching adapting multiplayer that I think we found most manageable. So I think we would encourage that if you're someone that's looking to introduce multiplayer to one of your games for the first time.
Yeah, and I was gonna ask, like, so how would you rate uh, implementing multiplayer as far as difficulty compared to like, um, for example, I'm curious, like, do you uh, for all the things we've implemented for all the games we've worked on, do you rank it the hardest thing that we've tackled, or no?
I would say no.
I
I
would
would
say
say one
no
of the
also.
biggest things,
I
yeah,
would
and
say
that's
no.
why I encourage, like, there's a lot of comments that say, hey, if you're a new game developer, don't use multiplayer, don't use multiplayer. I would kind of argue against that actually. Um, there's definitely things that you can implement in a single player game that are much more complicated than implementing multiplayer. Part of that is Gato does provide some really nice tools to help.
Yeah, I
Um,
was gonna ask you about that. How would you rank on a scale from 1 to 10? How would you rank the high level multiplayer tools that Godot provides for you.
Oh, in terms of like uh, which ones are the most easy to use, or
Or in terms of just in general. So basically, the if you were to implement multiplayer only using the high level multiplayer capabilities of Godot, which is basically what we did,
mm,
how would you rank those tools, knowing that we don't have a ton of experience with other ones, like on a scale of one to
I think
10?
they're yeah, I think they're great. I mean, I and again, I'm a bit biased because I really appreciate the team that develops these tools. Like, I think the main guy is I just know his GitHub thing is like Fables or something like that. It's Alessandro Fabioli or something like that.
Oh yeah,
Um, like mad respect for him and everyone that has contributed towards these tools. So I will say that makes me a bit biased, but I would give them 8 out of 10, 9 out of 10. They're really good.
yeah.
Look, I mean, they
I was
made
gonna give it a
people
9.
that don't know. Yeah, I mean, it allowed two people that have no background with network programming to be able to implement multiplayer. So I think that kind of speaks for itself,
I think
how good the tools are.
that's the testament right there. That's all you need to know. Two people that have zero experience in networking were able to get a basic two-player multiplayer set up. So I think that should be encouraging to anyone who wants to implement multiplayer in their game. Look, I won't say don't do multiplayer in your first game. If you really want to, then go for it. I would say that like the conventional wisdom of maybe tackling it on your second or third game, having gone through it, I do see why that is a thing, you know? Um,
Yeah, and we
but
were scared to do it. I mean, I'll just come out and say it. Like one of the reasons, like we definitely had to forcibly um, implement it as early as we did. But we were very tempted to keep pushing it off because well, I'll just speak for myself. I was definitely
well,
scared to try it.
yeah, we
But
didn't want to face it because we knew it would be a hard thing to do, and we knew that we would get stuck and frustrated. And I think actually a good place to end this episode would be to talk about um, an amusing anecdote about how we implemented multiplayer. You know the one I'm talking about?
uh, it's not coming to my front of mind
Okay,
actually.
so I'll start telling it, and then you can fill in the details. So
Okay.
I was talking with Eric. I think it was kind of early on in the week, and he works as a high school math teacher in Bangkok, Thailand. So he's kind of squeezing in these dev hours, in between classes and stuff after school. I'm the only one who's full time. My other two brothers each have full time jobs, so they're doing everything they can to squeeze in the hours in between, trying to hold down full time jobs. But it is kind of funny because one of the things that happens to Eric is classes will be over for the day and he'll keep working in the classroom, right? So this was so typically like if we're trying to implement a feature that's really difficult, it'll be the two of us working together, kind of pair programming. And so it was the day that we were going to do multiplayer and we were working all day, so like I would be working and then he would have a break and we would meet and we would do some more stuff. And we were getting some good progress, but we were really hard stuck at do you remember what the bug was? It was like the player one was controlling both players, right? That was the thing that we were really stuck on for a while.
Yeah, sounds about right.
Yeah, so basically separating the input system so that player one's inputs are handled for player one and player two's inputs were handled for player two. That was like really driving us up the wall. And one thing I will say about Eric is that he has a much harder time kind of if we're trying to implement a feature and it's in kind of a buggy state, he has a much harder time just kind of like letting it go. I'm a lot more like, hey, like let's get some rest, like we'll tackle it tomorrow. But he's pretty determined. And so,
Yeah, I'm definitely more of like a let's end on a win kind of a thing for the day.
yeah.
Can be a weakness sometimes for sure.
Well, it's funny
But yeah,
because
okay, I'm recalling this now.
I can hear it in your voice. Like I'll be like, "Hey, Eric, I think we should stop," and you'll be like, "Okay." So
Yeah,
like,
I remember being really bummed at the fact that we couldn't. We were close, but we just
yeah,
did that lingering bug of not being able to have the players control each other's input separately, and it was really bugging me.
right. So I was calling to pack it in, but I could tell in your voice you were really sad about that. And the other thing that happens is sometimes because he works after school at the high school, there's the janitorial staff who come in and clean the rooms, and let's just say that uh, there's definitely been quite a few times where he's been working on the game in the classroom, and one of the maids will come in and kick him out, which is always really funny. But this time
Yeah, and
he made a very he made a plea to the maids to let him stay for just a few more minutes because he was trying to implement multiplayer in his game. And Eric, on a scale of 1 to 10, how interested, 1 being very, very interested, 10 being very, very, very not interested, how interested were the maids in terms of seeing that the multiplayer was going to make it into the game?
about a 20.
Yeah, they were pissed.
Uh, they're a wonderful, wonderful staff. Like we have fantastic janitorial staff at our school. Shout out to them if any of them are watching. But unfortunately, uh, yeah, I hope that their sacrifice for staying a few minutes past being able to close the classroom will pay off once the community enjoys all the wonderful multiplayer moments that will come out of peltophobia, as we're calling it, working title.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, and I totally get where they're coming from. It's just kind of funny because we'll be like on the verge of a breakthrough, and it's just like, oh, can we just stay 5 more minutes? But I totally get it. So so he's on his way home. Keep in mind, it's probably like 4 a.m. local time for me. I'm dead tired. I really want to go to bed. I'm in bed. I'm like trying to go to sleep. I'm like, oh, I know he's thinking about it. He's like, it's gonna bother him. So I can't remember. Did I text you or did you text me? But basically,
I think because what happens is so we're like on a 12-hour time difference because I'm in Bangkok and Andrew's in California, so or it's like a 15-hour time difference. So when it's really early in the morning his time, it's kind of like afternoon my time. So a lot of times, um, one thing we'll do is we'll kind of chat. I'll be on my Bluetooth on my drive home, and Andy will be uh, yeah, working really late or something, and we'll kind of just go through like, okay, what's the next thing we want to develop and that kind of a thing. So at this point, it's normally kind of like, okay, Andrew's gonna rest, and I'm gonna finish driving home. But I think I did mention something along the lines of like, is there a chance you can fire up the computer and give it another one last chance?
right?
So,
Yes, you did mention that. And so I think I texted you. I said, yeah, I think we can. So you pulled over and got to a coffee shop and bummed off their Wi-Fi, and
oh right, yeah,
we cracked the final breakthrough. We were able to get it working. And that was such a great moment because I knew that you were gonna be able to go to bed better. I was gonna be able to go to bed better, and it felt way better than like ending on kind of like an unfinished note. So I'll never forget that. That
absolutely,
was like the first multiplayer game ever that we made, and that final breakthrough was like that I couldn't believe. I honestly couldn't believe that we did it. I was like, oh my gosh, and that's a huge credit to the Godot engine and their multiplayer features. I can't stress that enough. I mean, there's no way we would have been able to do that if the features weren't as well fleshed out as they are. So don't listen to any chatter out there about oh Godot's this or that, right? If you have the desire and you want to get something done, you can get it done. I firmly believe
yeah.
that.
If all of Hill Studios can implement multiplayer, you can as well.
Then you can too. And we'll have plenty of videos kind of covering different things. In fact, I will go ahead and link a couple videos in the description of this video. One video in particular by a YouTuber, DevLog Logan. I mean, without that video, we wouldn't have gotten it. So I will link that video as well as a couple others that we found helpful. So you can start there for some resources, but eventually we'll release our own resources to help out with that kind of stuff. I'll be sure to include links to those in the video description. So anyway, that's the story of multiplayer and how it got into Peltmophobia. Anything else you want to talk about, Eric, before we wrap up this episode?
Nope, I think that's good. Again, those of you guys that are starting to follow along with the journey of developing the game, we look forward to getting a chance to work on this with you all. And yeah, appreciate your support.
Yep. Thanks a lot. See you next episode.